Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to this webinar by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which will be about science-based target setting for the cement sector. My name is Carl Downey, and I'm a Senior Technical Manager at SBTi, and I'm leading this work on cement. So we're very excited to be having this webinar today, which marks the launch of the public consultation on the cement guidance that we're developing. So this cement project began last October and will end this June. So now we're taking this opportunity to get feedback from all of you on the draft guidance we have developed. So this is the first time we're releasing it publicly beyond the small group that has been working on it. So we're very interested to hear what you think of it. Before we start, just a few guidelines for this webinar. It's a Zoom webinar, which means the participants in the audience have their camera and microphone automatically muted. However, you can ask questions by submitting through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session where we will aim to answer as many of those questions as possible. The slides used in this webinar will be shared afterwards. And please also note that the webinar is being recorded and will be published for the benefit of those who cannot attend. So here's the agenda for our webinar today. We've scheduled an hour and a half in total, but we aim to get through most of the content in good time in order to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So we're going to start with an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then move on to an explanation of what science-based targets are, including some important information about our net zero standard and the differences between near and long-term targets. Then we'll present to you our project on cement, what the guidance we've been developing covers, and what topics we're seeking feedback on during the public consultation, which is launching today. We will then have a presentation from a guest speaker from Holcim, one of our company members and funder of this project, about the value of science-based targets to companies. And then we'll finish off with the Q&A session. During the webinar, we're also going to have a number of polls so we can get an idea of who is in the audience. So we're going to launch the first question from the poll now, which is about what type of organization are you from? So that poll will be launched now. We'll leave it open for a few minutes so they have an opportunity to respond. And in the meantime, I would like to introduce the team that's working on today's webinar. So as I said, I'm a Senior Technical Manager at the SBTi, and I lead the work on buildings, steel, and cement. There'll be two other speakers during this session, Andres Chang, who's a Research Manager at SBTi, as well as Antonio Carrillo, who's Head of Climate and Energy at Holcim. Mike Danielson, who's a Senior Associate at SBTi, will moderate the Q&A session later. And I also want to thank those who've been working behind the scenes on this project and also on this webinar. That's Amir Khan and Paulina Moreno. So it's thanks to them that this webinar is happening today. And I also want to thank Emma Watson, who's Senior Net Zero Manager at SBTi, who spoke during this morning's webinar. So now we're going to end the first question from the poll and have a look at the results. So what type of organization do you represent? We can see that the largest share is at 39% from companies. Then we have consulting firms, and then smaller shares from academia, government, industry associations, NGOs, and other. So of course, this is maybe to be expected that it's companies that are most interested in finding out about this cement guidance as they may be thinking about setting targets. So we hope that they will learn something from today's webinar. So now to start off the agenda, I'm going to give some background on the Science-Based Targets Initiative and on the cement project specifically. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the SBTi, is a collaboration between four organizations: CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. And what we do is we aim to encourage companies to take ambitious climate action by setting meaningful climate targets that are aligned with the latest science. And the way we do this is by developing resources that help companies understand the level of ambition needed for their particular case, and also by validating company targets. We've made good progress so far. We have over 1,000 companies already setting science-based targets, and well over 2,000 committed to set targets in the near future. And we've already reached what is a key milestone for us, which is a critical mass of over 20% of high-impact companies setting targets in many sectors and regions. So SBT, science-based targets, are becoming mainstream, which is our aim. And what is the impact of this in terms of emission reductions? We see that companies who have science-based targets decarbonize faster than the market as a whole. So companies with science-based targets reduce their emissions by 25% between 2015 and 2020, compared with an increase of over 3% in global emissions from energy and industry over the same time period. And a typical company with science-based targets reduced direct emissions at an annual rate of 6.4%, which exceeds even the rate required by the SBTi to meet the 1.5 degree scenarios, which is a 4.2% annual reduction. So we're going to launch another poll question now, which is about where your organization is based. So we launch that poll now and we leave it open for a few minutes so you have a chance to respond. In the meantime, I'm going to give some background to the SBTi's Cement project. So many of you may know that it's already possible for cement companies to set targets using the SBTi tools, that is, targets with an ambition level of well below 2 degrees. The idea of launching this project was to provide the resources for those companies to set 1.5 degree aligned targets. So to do this, we needed to develop a 1.5 degree pathway for cement. And we also wanted to develop more detailed target setting rules and guidance so companies understand what they need to do, and that these rules and guidance will cover both near-term targets and long-term targets. This project is being funded by Holcim, so we would like to thank Holcim for that. We're very grateful for their support. The timeline of the project can be seen on the slide. We're over halfway through the project now and we're well on track. So today marks the launch of the public consultation, which will run for 1 month. And the final resources are on track to be published in June. So this timeline is updated regularly and can be viewed on our webpage. One of the important parts of all of SBTi's resource development projects is the creation of an expert advisory group to accompany the project. So the Cement group can be seen on this slide. And the members of this group were carefully selected to provide a diverse balance of companies, NGOs, and academia, as well as coming from different geographies. You should be aware that the role of this group is advisory. Final sign-off on the deliverables is by the SBTi. I also want to point out that the draft documents that we are making available today and the content that I'm presenting in this webinar don't necessarily represent the views of the whole expert advisory group. They're proposals, draft proposals that are on the table now so that you as stakeholders will be able to comment on them in the public consultation. And the expert advisory group will then continue working between now and June to finalize the guidance. We're going to end the second poll question now about where your organization is based and show the results. So we can see a large majority in this session coming from Europe and North America and South America, with much smaller numbers from Africa and Asia and Oceania, which of course is to do with the time zones. We did run 2 sessions to account for time zones, and we do hope to encourage companies from all regions to sign up to science-based targets. So for the next part of the agenda on what are science-based targets, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Andres Chang, who will give some background on this. So over to you, Andres.
Thanks, Carl. Next slide, please. If you're on this webinar, odds are you have some understanding of science-based targets. But for this section, I'm going to start with the Paris Agreement, which is around when the Science-Based Targets Initiative was founded, and move from there. So science-based targets are emissions reduction targets that show companies, their stakeholders, and financial institutions just how fast and how much they need to reduce emissions to align with climate goals. The SBTi was founded right around the same time as the Paris Agreement in 2015. In 2015, through the Paris Agreement, countries around the world agreed to limit global temperature increase to well below 2°C and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, as well as other goals like adapting to the impacts of climate change, making financial flows more consistent, the low emissions and climate resilient future. But overall, SBTs are focused on mitigating climate change in the business community through emissions reductions. Next slide. The SBTi was founded on a very simple idea, and that idea is that businesses should be reducing emissions by an amount consistent with climate goals based on science. The science behind SBTs starts with a societal climate goal. The SBTi last year made a decision to increase the minimum ambition of all of our frameworks to 1.5 degrees, because we now have such a good understanding of the devastating impacts of exceeding that temperature limit. So starting with this specific goal, that can be translated into an emissions budget at the global level, disaggregated down to the sector level. And eventually there are methods that companies use to set emissions targets based on some input data, like their starting point, which is going to account for their emissions intensity or their absolute emissions in a year, their projected growth rate, and other important variables as well. So this is a really good diagram just showing the basic science behind science-based targets. Next slide. The SBTi relies on two science-based target setting approaches primarily. There are other approaches that we allow for scope 3 targets. So those are targets that cover a company's upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions. But for targets that cover a company's own operations and their purchased electricity, there are two methods that we recognize. The first one is carbon intensity convergence. So this is based on all of the companies in a sector converging to a shared emissions intensity for the sector in a future year, such as 2050. This method is really great because it allows companies to express their target in terms of tons of CO2 per some unit of output. This helps in terms of strategy, planning, and expressing the mitigation actions that companies might take. Its limitation is that it requires companies to have some sort of homogeneous output that reflects the sector. For cement, developing targets in terms of tons of CO2 is a clear way of using this method. The other approach that the SBTi recognizes is based on absolute emissions reductions. So all companies assumed to reduce emissions by the same rate in absolute terms. For the SBTi, our absolute contraction minimum reduction rate is 4.2% linear annual reduction. This translates to a 42% reduction between 2020 to 2030. Most companies submitting to the SBTi set absolute targets for about a 50% reduction by 2030. Next slide. In the next section, I'm going to talk about the SBTi's net zero standard. So when the SBTi was founded back in 2015, we were focused on near-term and mid-term targets. Those are emissions targets that go 5 to 15 years into the future. However, with the release of the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, which really highlighted the importance of reaching net zero at the global level by mid-century, there's been a rapid and impressive uptake in net zero targets across the board. This includes country level targets, business targets, financial institution targets, city targets. We on the SBTi saw an important gap to fill in terms of helping improve the quality of these targets and really harnessing that energy to make sure that we're aligning with what's needed to reach net zero at the global level. These charts just show some of the the coverage of net zero targets on the left. You can see that when you count for all of these different kinds of targets, so much of global emissions, GDP, and the population is covered. And a lot of this growth has occurred since 2020, when the UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign was launched. The SBTi's net zero standard is recognized under the UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign for businesses that want to participate. Next slide. As I briefly mentioned in the last slide, one of the reasons that we moved forward with this net zero standard was to improve the quality and consistency of net zero targets. When we first started looking at net zero targets a couple years ago, it was really hard to understand the quality of those targets. Some of them were not as rigorous as maybe they should have been. And really, this diagram shows 4 dimensions along which net zero targets differ, but I often simplify it to 3 dimensions: what's covered, what counts, and by when. The SBTi's net zero standard provides a level of consistency for all of these questions, and it also aims to align with science in terms of how we answer the question of what's covered, what counts, and by when. So we require companies to cover virtually their entire value chain for setting long-term targets. For near-term targets, the SBTi allows a little bit more flexibility around scope 3 boundary coverage to recognize and encourage best practice, but for long-term targets, really pushing companies to go further by covering their entire value chain. Likewise, for net zero and near-term targets, the SBTi has always been focused on emissions reductions within the company's value chain. So scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reductions, and really keeping a priority on these emissions reductions before we even bring offsets or carbon removals into the picture. And lastly, under the SBTi's net zero standard, we want to make sure that net zero targets are not a replacement for near-term action. We now require companies to set near-term SBTs, 5 to 10-year targets, as a prerequisite for net zero targets, which can be all the way out to 2050 and are intended to have companies set targets to align their emissions with what's needed to reach net zero at the sector or global level. Next slide, please. So this can be summed up in 4 elements. The need to set near-term science-based targets. So these are emissions reduction targets in line with 1.5 degree pathways, covering a 5 to 10-year timeframe. Long-term science-based targets. These are targets to reduce emissions to a residual level by no later than 2050. There's a key difference between near-term SBTs and long-term SBTs, which is that long-term SBTs are based on getting to a residual emissions level consistent with net zero. Companies can choose their target year, but the ambition won't change. Beyond value chain mitigation, so we recognize that in the immediate transition to net zero, companies should be taking action to contribute to climate mitigation beyond their value chain. Some companies do this by purchasing carbon credits or investing in R&D and future climate solutions. We recognize that this is really important in addition to reducing emissions for many companies. And lastly, that when companies reach net zero, they should be neutralizing any unabated residual emissions with permanent removals. In the near term, companies should be focused on beyond value chain mitigation, which can include a whole wide range of activities, but in the long term, if we're going to align with net zero at the global level, it's going to be required for companies to permanently neutralize their unabated emissions. Next slide. And now I'll pass it back to Carl to take us into the next section.
Great, thank you very much, Andres. So I think a few things that Andres mentioned there are very relevant for the cement project. One is how the convergence approach works and why we need to set up a cement pathway in terms of emissions intensity. And the second one is the elements that are contained in a long-term net zero target, which includes short-term targets as well, which is covered in the cement guidance. We're now going to launch poll question number 3, which is about what your company's status is with regards to SBTs, with regard to science-based targets. So we leave that running for a few minutes so you have a chance to respond to it. And now we're going to move on to the next section in the agenda, which is the detail on what the cement project has developed so far and what is contained in the draft guidance. And in fact, I'm going to hand back to Andres for the first part of this, which is about cross-sector work that SBTi undertook to define what is appropriate in terms of emission scenarios for 1.5. So I'll hand back to Andres.
Thanks, Carl. Of course, the cement sector project is part of the SBTi's broader work for developing guidance and criteria across the entire economy. And one thing that's been really important for the SBTi, and where we've been a leader since our founding around 7 years ago, is in understanding what are emissions scenarios that should be used for setting science-based targets. When it comes to sector-specific projects like the cement project, there's a lot of work undertaken by the expert advisory group to actually flesh out the details of this pathway. But we also have a cross-sector research stream to ensure that across all of the sectors that SBTi works on, we're ensuring a level of consistency and rigor and alignment with what science says is needed. So I'm going to give you a quick summary of our cross-sector research focused on mitigation pathways before handing it back to Carl to dig into the specifics of what it means for cement. This cross-sector research is really designed to advance a common understanding of what it takes to align with 1.5 degrees via near-term and long-term climate targets. For anyone who's keeping up to date on climate news, you know that we have a very brief window to actually align with 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degree line targets are not easy and require rapid reductions in mitigation from virtually every sector. Some of the work around pathways is to ensure that in aggregate across our different sector projects, these pathways don't exceed a cumulative emissions budget. One of the risks that we've identified as an initiative is that if each sector is just deciding on its own target in isolation, it's quite possible that the sum of all of these emissions budgets will exceed what's needed at the global level. And of course, in this cross-sector research, we want to chart a clear direction for new, more sector-specific, highly granular research focused on roadmaps, building collaborations that fulfill a specific ambition range. And that's the approach that's been taken with the cement project, sort of building from this cross-sector perspective, digging deeper into what's needed. Next slide. We are focused on mitigation pathways that can be used to steer voluntary climate action, contribute to achieving the 1.5 degree objective of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, and reach net zero CO2 emissions at the global level by 2050. Net zero greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for all gases in the Kyoto Protocol, need to be reached in 2050 or later in the second half of the century. To really develop this cross-sector framework, we were building from a lot of different resources, and the 6 key ones are the IPCC's special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, some of our initial work on the SBTi, like foundations of science-based target setting and foundations for science-based targets in the net zero for foundations for science-based net zero targets in the corporate sector. We looked at peer-reviewed literature to understand what assumptions and targets we can set for land use and agriculture. We also were using the IEA's net zero scenario as a reference. And lastly, the IPCC's most recent AR6 report. If you're interested in really digging into the technical details, you can find this paper on the right, Pathways to Net Zero, on our website. Next slide. What that paper lays out is the aggregate outcome of all of the different pathways that we have produced and are producing in sector projects. So in aggregate, we're focused on staying within the remaining carbon budget for a 50% likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. That's critical because it means that we're not relying on late century CO2 removal at levels that we don't know are possible to get back below this budget range. We're looking at emissions reductions for CO2 and methane that are roughly consistent with the IEA's net zero emissions scenario. But again, the details for each sector are being decided at the sector level through work with each sector's EAG. We are assuming that forestry, land use, and agriculture emissions are reduced by an amount consistent with the detailed land sector roadmap in Rowe et al., which is a peer-reviewed paper that is very highly respected. We also are developing flag sector guidance where companies with land-intensive activities are expected to set targets consistent with this roadmap. And in aggregate, we're assuming that to reach net zero at the global level by 2050, we are going to need some level of CO2 removal, about 1 to 4 gigatons per year. And that will reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 or later, depending on the level of CO2 removal that's actually achieved. So of course, there's no way of really predicting exactly how much CO2 removal will occur. But this, for transparency, is really 4 key assumptions that have gone into our work. As I mentioned several times already, sector-specific pathways are developed at the sector level. The idea is that we want to foster stakeholder collaboration and innovation through convening an advisory group, inviting feedback through consultations like these, and really getting into the nitty-gritty details. Sometimes that means looking at technology deployment in more detail, and for some sectors, looking into regionalized pathways as well. Next slide. An important part of this is allocating emissions across sectors. So the first step for us, and I'm not going to get into all of these details, was to disaggregate the overall 500 gigaton budget into a budget for energy and industrial process CO2 emissions, and then a budget for land use related emissions. Next slide. The next part of this process was disaggregating a budget down into different sectors that can be worked with at the sector level. We ended up using the IEA net zero scenario as an upper budget range for each sector in the energy system. So that means that for the cement sector project, and really for all of the sector projects shown in this table on the left, the remaining CO2 budget that's being worked with by the EAG cannot exceed the sector's budget in the IEA's net zero scenario. There's other research that we've referenced to find a lower range on the budget, and this is really just for reference, but we want to understand if we pulled all of the different mitigation levers, how much more could we be reducing emissions from that sector? Because the IEA net zero scenario is very ambitious, it's quite rigorous and stringent, but not everyone agrees with it. And there are ways that the cement sector and every sector could reduce emissions even more. For example, through demand side changes that might not be captured in the IEA's net zero scenario, or supply side changes that aren't captured, and differences in terms of how mitigation is balanced across different sectors. Next slide. We do this work with contributions and review from our scientific advisory group. This is a group of about 15 experts, including several IPCC lead authors and other pioneering academics that you can see at the right. We do aim to work very closely with this group, so we have quarterly meetings with them, and many of them have been with us for 3 or 4 years. These folks have pretty diverse expertise in climate science, energy system modeling, land sector mitigation, and regional pathways. So they really are important in terms of checking our work and making sure that we're making all of these assumptions as clear and transparent as possible. I'll pass it back to Carl at this point to take you into the specifics of what it means for cement.
Great, thank you very much, Andres. So indeed, that really lays the foundations of the work that we needed to undertake for choosing a 1.5 degree emission scenario specifically for cement. So I'll explain that in a moment, but first, we're just going to end the poll question number 3, which was about companies' status on science-based targets. So we can have a look at the results. So we can see there that the largest amount at 25% is organizations who are considering committing to set a science-based targets. Then we have organizations that have already committed to set a science-based target, and at a slightly lower level, organizations that have already got validated science-based targets, as well as, of course, those kind of organizations that cannot set science-based targets because they're not companies. So an interesting mix there, and we hope that after the publication of these guidelines, you will all be well set up to commit or set or update indeed targets that you may already have. So we'll move on now to the specifics of the cement project. And I just want to, before I present the discussion on choosing an emission scenario for cement, I want to ask 2 important questions that it's important to consider. First is, why indeed does the cement sector warrant a dedicated pathway and resources when some other sectors have to use the SBTi's cross-sectoral methods? And the second question is whether cement production is the right basis for the pathway, or if it should be something else. So first of those questions, does the cement sector warrant dedicated pathways and resources? There's 3 main reasons why we believe it does, why it's both desirable and feasible to have cement-specific pathways and resources. The first is that cement is a large industrial sector and a large source of emissions, so therefore it's a priority area for SBTi. The second is that modeling and data on cement is available in the emission scenario literature, such as that from IEA and others. So it was feasible to develop a cement-specific pathway. And the third reason is that the bottom-up models, IEAs, which are aiming to allocate the carbon budgets through sectors, do this through a cost-optimal balancing of decarbonization levers across sectors. So the size of the allocation that each sector gets depends on the decarbonization levers available in that sector and their cost compared to the same thing for other sectors. And for cement, due to its process emissions or geogenic emissions, that is, the emissions from decarbonization of limestone and clinker production, the rates that the sector can decarbonize in those emission scenarios tends to be different from the overall rate for society as a whole. So plausible emission scenarios may not follow the cross-sector rate, which justifies having a sector-specific rate. Then the second question that we need to answer is whether cement production is the correct basis for this work and for the pathway. And I'm asking this because some people sometimes ask, why are we not using concrete production as the basis of the pathway? Because if we did that, then maybe there will be more decarbonization levers available to the industry because they can optimize or reduce the amount of cement per unit of concrete as a way of reducing their emissions further. So in fact, there's good reasons to keep the pathway at the level of cement, which I'll explain now. So the first one is that, of course, the largest share of cement and concrete sector emissions do come from cement production, which is the priority for science-based target setting and for SBTi. Second reason is that only a small part of the large cement companies' cement goes into their own concrete, and independent concrete producers tend to be small. So having targets on the basis of concrete would not makes sense for the big cement companies, which are responsible for the bulk of emissions. The next reason is that if we're just talking about concrete production after the cement has already been made, the emissions come from fuels and electricity, which is similar to any other sector and therefore could fit well with our cross-sectoral target setting method. We don't need a specific target setting method for that part of the production process, unlike for clinker production. And then the next reason is that, in fact, target setting methods that we use to allow even cement companies to take into account the optimization of cement demand in concrete. Because when these companies submit their data for setting targets, they need to show that their absolute emissions, as well as their emissions per ton of cement, don't lead to the carbon budget being exceeded. So by optimizing how much cement they produce for the same volume of concrete can be an interesting decarbonization lever that would help them meet their targets. And the final reason, the most important reason, is of course we're not leaving concrete out. Concrete production is still included in the guidance documents we're developing, and these explain how concrete companies and also cement companies producing concrete can set science-based targets that would cover that production. So given that everything that Andreas has presented and the fact that we wanted a cement-based pathway, we have a number of characteristics that we use in the SBTi to choose an emission scenario that would meet the requirements. So first is plausibility, that the emission scenario should have a credible narrative of how the emission reductions will be achieved. The second one is responsibility. It should avoid the risk of the objective not being achieved or reduce that risk. It should be objective, so it shouldn't take the view of just one industry into account, and it should be consistent. So it should be a scenario that's consistent internally and externally across our sector work. So the project team identified 3 potential emission scenarios we could use that fit those criteria, and also the budget ranges identified by Andreas. First is the IEA Net Zero report from 2021 itself. The second one was the One Earth climate model from the University of Technology, Sydney. And the third one, which we discussed, was modifying the data in the IEA Net Zero report for a few reasons. For example, to make emissions reductions in the near term even more ambitious. In the end, we've decided to go for the published version of the IEA Net Zero report, as that offers the most transparency, clarity, and consistency with other work. So we look at what this actually means when we convert it into an intensity pathway for cement. You can see we go from absolute emissions to emissions per ton of cement. On the slide on the right is the scope 1 emission intensity pathway in orange for 1.5 degrees, and we're comparing it in blue to the current pathways, which are well below 2 degrees. And you can see this is a steeper lining leading to lower residual emissions in 2050. It may appear at first glance that it's less ambitious in the years before 2030. This is in fact just because the more up-to-date base year data is slightly higher. Because our methods work on getting companies to converge towards this pathway, we see that this new steeper pathway is always leading to more ambitious near-term targets and long-term targets for companies. And that also highlights another important point. The advantage of the convergence approach for companies is that their starting point is taken into account. So their base year emissions, if they're higher than an average, are taken into account. So each company's near-term target level will be different. Then on the next slide, we just have a look at what the scope 2 pathway looks like. Here we see increasing electricity demand in cement due to electrification and carbon capture and storage. But a rapidly decarbonizing electricity grid means that the pathway in terms of CO2 emissions is nevertheless more ambitious than the well below 2 degree pathway. So throughout this presentation, I will be highlighting a few questions that we have in the public consultation, for which we want your feedback. So there's just two that are based on the material we presented so far. One, do you agree with the choice of the IEA Net Zero report as the source of 1.5 degree pathways for cement? And if you don't agree, why not? So we don't intend to open a discussion on these now, but you will have the chance to respond in writing through the consultation. So at this point, I'm going to open the next poll, question number 4 in the poll, which is about what area you are most interested in terms of this guidance for cement. So we leave that open for a few minutes so that you can respond. And I'll move on to the next part, which is about the criteria and guidance that we've developed. So once the emission scenarios were decided, the rest of the guidance really deals with emissions accounting questions and target setting guidance. And I should emphasize that our aim was not to change too much in the way things are done already by the industry in terms of accounting and also in terms of target setting. It was more that we wanted to help companies understanding what they need to do and also clarify things to make sure that all actions for emission reductions towards targets are really strengthening climate action. And as I said before, these are still open, some of these topics, and do not necessarily represent the views of the whole expert advisory group, but we wanted to present the current proposals for your views. So on the next slide, we have just the principles of the guidance. We're relying here on the greenhouse gas protocol as we do across the SBTi for greenhouse gas accounting. And in the cement sector, there's also a cement CO2 protocol based on the greenhouse gas protocol, which offers more specific guidance for cement. So we refer to and rely on that, and we make some specific tweaks or comments to which of the definitions in that protocol can be used in target setting. The first one of these has to do with how we should deal with emissions from waste-derived fuels. So many of you will know that in the cement sector, the industry has two definitions for emissions. One is gross emissions, which include the emissions from waste-derived fuels. And the second is net emissions, which exclude the emissions from waste-derived fuels. In the guidance document, we've made it very clear that target setting should always be based on the gross emissions, so including waste-derived fuels. And in fact, this is what SBTi has always mandated in terms of target setting, but now we're trying to make it even clearer in this guidance. And the other thing that we're asking companies to do is when they publish their validated targets, that they need to make it clear in their target wording that they're dealing with gross emissions. Another point in the guidance where we modify current rules or practice is to do with Scope 3 emissions. So many of you might know that for near-term targets right now, our guidance is that Scope 3 targets are not required if those emissions make up less than 40% of total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for the company. And that happens to often be the case for the cement industry, where Scope 1 and 2 is the largest part of emissions. However, we're making two changes to this. The first is to do with the upstream emissions from fuels. So that is the refining and distribution of fuels before they're burned in the cement plant. Here, we're introducing a requirement for mandatory Scope 3 targets that would cover the upstream impacts of fuels. And this is really to harmonize with other sector projects like transport, where that is the normal approach that is taken. The second new element we're introducing here as a recommendation rather than a requirement is about purchased cement and clinker, where we've seen an issue that if a company who was producing most of their clinker but then moved to a model where they were purchasing more of it and producing less, they would see their Scope 1 emissions go down. But if they had no Scope 3 target, this wouldn't be captured in rising Scope 3 emissions. So there's potential leakage here of emissions. So we're recommending that all companies in their near-term targets should include a Scope 3 target for purchased clinker and cement. The advantage of this is also that we harmonize a little bit better between those types of companies that are more about producing their own clinker and those that are buying it and blending it into cement. So the boundary will be more similar. So in the open consultation, we would like your opinion on these. Do you agree with these new criteria and recommendations on Scope 3 emissions for near-term targets? Don't forget that for long-term targets, you must include all Scope 3 emissions. And secondly, should the targets covering purchased cement and clinker be mandatory or only recommended, as we put in the draft version of the guidance today? So I'm going to move on now to a few more pieces of the guidance which are about cement and concrete specific processes. But before I do that, I'm just going to close the last poll and see the results. This poll question was about what is the area you're most interested in? And we can see 59% of the audience is interested in understanding how science-based target setting works. And then lower numbers want to learn about what the target setting process entails and how science-based targets will encourage industry to decarbonize. Great. So we'll move on now to this section about guidance on cement and concrete specific processes. The first of these, which had a lot of discussion in the expert advisory group, was natural carbonation of concrete, sometimes called natural cement recarbonation. And this is the process whereby cement-based products such as concrete absorb CO2 from the air. And it's a well-known and well-studied process. And in fact, it's carefully controlled in the design of structural concrete because it can lead to corrosion of reinforcement, which would negatively affect the durability of those structures. However, this carbonation is not included today in national or corporate greenhouse gas accounting. So the question is whether it should or should not be somehow included in science-based target setting. So right now, the proposal that we're making in the draft guidance is that natural carbonation should not be included as an emission reduction towards meeting a science-based target because we feel that it risks weakening climate action for a few reasons. The first is that science-based targets are intended to incentivize additional actions. But if we include natural recarbonation, all it would do would change the accounting rules because we would effectively lower the baseline emissions, base year emissions, and also the target year emissions by the same amount, but we wouldn't be changing anything in terms of a company's opportunity to decarbonize. And the second reason why it is a little bit tricky is that there's no real way today to link natural carbonation in structures happening around us to a specific producer of cement or concrete. So there's a risk that several companies could want to claim for the same CO2 uptake as part of their target. Nevertheless, this could be an area for further study, and SBTi does have a project coming up on beyond value chain mitigation where this could be looked at again. The next cement and concrete specific process that we looked at was industrial mineralization, which is similar to natural carbonation, but it's more where CO2 is being absorbed or being injected as part of an industrial process. And here we felt that there was value in including this or encouraging actions that would lead to more CO2 being taken up during production process. So we're talking about production process here, for example, CO2 injected or absorbed in the manufacture of ready-mix concrete or in precast concrete, or indeed treatment of certain types of wastes where CO2 can be absorbed to create aggregates products. There's many different configurations you can imagine here where CO2 is being captured directly or it's being captured and then transferred to another entity to be used in an industrial process. be cautious, we are just accepting one version of this in the draft guidance, which is whereby the company that is capturing CO2 and mineralizing it into a product on the same site. And that way the accounting is easy and we avoid the problems of leakage in transportation, for example, and also the problem of ownership of who gets the benefit for having saved that CO2. Again, this could be an area for further work and further development by SBTi. The next area where we discussed some processes that are extremely relevant to cement production was carbon capture and use and carbon capture and storage. And here the intention is not to come up with any kind of criteria that are specific to cement. We would like to have SBTi-wide criteria. So here we're just pointing to a few principles that are already being applied by SBTi. And again, these may be developed in further detail. So the first is about carbon capture and use in all other cases besides the industrial mineralization that I just mentioned. So here, where that is in short-lived products, such as in e-fuels, it cannot count as an emission reduction towards science-based targets, as this is CO2 that will be emitted again a short time afterwards, and you again have the issue of the ownership of that saving. It's like an avoided emission, which is always outside of the scope of science-based targets. The second item that we discussed was carbon capture and permanent geological storage, where we think in principle this should count as an emission reduction towards meeting science-based targets and can be the subject of more detailed work. And then the third one is bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which similarly to carbon capture and storage can count as an emission reduction, but should follow the general rules we have on bioenergy, whereby it shall in no case be counted as a net negative emissions. So bioenergy emissions are always greater than or equal to zero. And by the way, removals and emissions in industrial sectors should always be declared separately according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Then the final area on cement and concrete specific processes that we have put into the draft guidance is this idea of optimizing the amount of cement that we're using in concrete as an important decarbonization lever, where because targets for cement companies are in terms of ton of CO2 per ton of cement, it may be that they feel that these kind of optimizations are not available to them as a lever to meet their targets. So in the guidance, we provide some recommendations for how they can make sure that these are part of their target setting. One is they can publish the production volumes associated with their target year. So then stakeholders can see how much of their mitigation comes from optimizing their volumes. And another recommendation, which is similar, is developing targets in absolute terms rather than in intensity terms. These are just recommendations, they're not requirements. So based on what I've just presented, we have a number of questions in the open consultation. The first one is whether the guidance and the pathway that have been chosen sufficiently incentivize near-term emission reductions in the cement industry. So emissions in the next 5 to 10 years, which is crucial. And the second question is to get your view on natural carbonation, how it should be dealt with. According to what I just presented, where we don't allow it to be accounted towards science-based targets. Or another option is where, again, we don't allow it to be counted as an emission reduction, but it could be used to neutralize residual emissions once the long-term target is reached as a kind of beyond value chain mitigation. So we're interested in your views on those. I'm just going to mention two more things in the draft guidance before handing over to our speaker from Holcim, Antonio. So it's interesting for you all to know that the guidance includes explanation for how companies all along the cement value chain can use these pathways to set their targets. So we're talking about companies that also make, the cement companies that also make concrete and other products, cement companies that don't produce their own clinker, but just purchase it. Concrete companies that don't produce their own clinker or their own cement, and then other potential users of cement, so construction companies that may buy cement. So the guidance lays out how all of these types of companies can use the tools to set their targets. And it also shows how, for a company that's purchasing cement and therefore those emissions are really part of their scope 3, instead of using one of our generic scope 3 methods, they can use the cement pathway to set targets just covering their cement procurement. And then the final thing to say is that we do have 2 target setting tools on the next slide, which help companies to calculate for their particular cases what their targets should be for near-term and long-term. So these go along with the guidance document as part of this consultation. So we would ask you to test them with your own numbers and see if they make sense and if they work, and report any issues back to us. So that's all we wanted to present on the guidance. We'll have Q&A in a few minutes, but first I'm going to hand over to Antonio Carrillo, who's Head of Climate and Energy at Holcim, and is a member of our expert advisory group, who will talk about the value of science-based targets to companies. Over to you, Antonio.
Thank you, Carl, and congrats to you and Andres and Emma for the presentation. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Before I start, just to say that, as Carl said in the beginning, at Holcim, we acknowledge the current draft guidelines presented by SBTi. However, we have some reservations on a few of the proposed points that are still being discussed with the advisory group, and we'll provide feedback accordingly as part of the public consultation process. But if we go now and kick off the presentation, in the next slide, some quick facts about Holcim. I promise to be quick on this one. We're building material company with leading presence in more than 70 countries, more than 2,000 sites and 70,000 employees worldwide. And we're mainly active in 4 business segments: aggregates, ready mix, solutions and products as concrete products, and of course cement. And there are 2 main strategic fields, sustainability and innovation, in which we have a clear focus on climate change aspects, which is really at the heart of what we do. We truly believe we really have a role to play in supporting the decarbonization of the industry. And if we go to the next slide, just to summarize a bit, because our focus in reducing our carbon footprint is not something new. We've reduced already about 20% of our scope 1 and 2 emissions footprint per ton of cement since 1990. But we felt there was missing something. We wanted to really get the things right. And in 2020, we signed a business ambition for 1.5 pledge, and also got validated our near-term 2030 targets, which were aligned with the well below 2 degree scenario. And in the absence of those guidelines of 1.5, that's where we engaged with SBTi, and therefore this project that we are very excited to see how it's getting traction. And also quite recently, as part of the net zero standard, and right before the COP26, we were able to validate our 2050 targets as net zero as well. And with these goals, now we're very proud to have a very unique setup with 2030, 2050 targets validated by SBTi for all the scopes. But today I won't talk more about our targets, but really why this was important for us. And if we go to the next slide, I'm probably going to start with the most obvious one, but probably the most interesting. It really helped to expand our focus within the company and raise awareness internally and mobilize the organization drastically. On expanding the focus, let me explain. So Holcim has historically mainly focused on scope 1 emissions for obvious reasons. 75% of our footprint is coming from our direct emissions, almost 50% alone from the decarbonation of the raw materials used for cement production. And thanks to this engagement, when we first have the near-term targets back in 2020, we had to include the scope 2 emissions, and despite this being only 5% of our footprint, it helped us to unlock a number of opportunities on the renewable energy field, new power purchase agreements, new waste heat recovery projects, and later, before COP, with our net zero targets, we expand this to scope 3, and this also helped us to mobilize the value chain, engagement with customers, with clients, with suppliers. So really, that really helped us to think more holistically on our footprint, and also internally to mobilize the organization at a different level. The making of our pledges, we like to call it, was a journey in itself. As you can imagine, committing to these sort of targets is not something that happens from one way to another. So there was a lot of work internally. We had to mobilize all our experts to assess projections, scenarios, decarbonization levers, and that really created a momentum that was fantastic. It helped to accelerate a lot our efforts, and as mentioned, functions that were historically not so engaged, this could be logistic or procurement, now be much more in the battle, and bringing that excitement and that sense of purpose in the company. So in summary, it really helped to accelerate our efforts, to motivate our employees, and to bring a new level of engagement across all the functions in the organization. But that was not only an internal sort of transformation. If we can go quickly to the next slide, I'd also like to show what I think has been other opportunities that we've been able to foster thanks to having these SBTs. No, really, I mean, a no-brainer is the effect or the impact, the dependency on ESG ratings for those being in companies reporting to having to provide data to these ESG ratings. You've probably seen how the bar has actually raised now. It's no longer enough to have a target. It has to be validated. So we had seen obviously a change into the scores we were actually getting on those, and having sort of a different level of recognition on leadership and sustainability. But it also unlocked, interestingly, partnerships. It's a topic that we manage quite proactively, but after we signed the Business Ambition 1.5 and the first SBTs, we got a lot of requests. So one of the examples was actually the consortium, Sustainability Consortium on Climate with the MIT. We're really sort of excited about the SBTs that we had just signed at the time, and something more related to the business on the supply chain. A lot of discussions, a lot of engagement, not only with suppliers, obviously to secure sources of raw materials, et cetera, but also with customers. So having low carbon products, being able to articulate how we link our targets with our production, and how we're going to help our customers to reach their scope 3 targets, which actually are linked to our scope 1 targets. A lot of discussions on that field, very important, the connection between really our production and our customers' needs. I can also speak about investors, but I'm pretty sure most in the call know how they're pushing. So there's an increasing number of requests to align with SBTs, to align with the latest level of ambition, and obviously having those in place have facilitated drastically the discussions on a number of topics. Something that I haven't mentioned here is also a clear reaction on talent attraction and retention. CVs, people wanted to work for us because of those sort of commitments. And my favorite one, which is probably not that popular, is sustainable finance and the sustainability linked bonds, which to me, it's really, it's closing the circle. If we can go to the next slide, I'll explain in a second. So we've got a wholesome commitment to reach more than 40% of sustainable financing by 2050 as part of our strategy. And obviously we explore a number of mechanisms to do so, sustainability linked bonds being one of them. And I was surprised was when we were coming up with this strategy, how well received was the fact that our 23 targets were actually validated by SBTi. So we could actually, at the time, I remember November 2020, launch a bond of 850 million, I think was issued in November, that was actually linked to the target that we just signed, and obviously having penalties in case we don't reach it. So this is very important, really, to not only commit to the targets, but also have some sort of link to our strategy and being able to demonstrate we're walking the talk. And I think with this, Carl, Andres, I'm going to stop here. That's just wanted to give you a sense of what we felt while doing the process. I'm very excited to be part of the group and continue to support you in this journey. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you very much, Antonio. Very interesting to hear the company perspective there, and we hope it encourages other companies to take the same journey. We are now going to pass on to the final part of the agenda, which is the Q&A session, and I'm going to hand over to Mike Danielson from the SBTi, who's going to moderate this session. So over to you, Mike. Yes,
thanks, Carl. So thanks to everybody who entered questions into our Q&A box here. I think we have addressed some of those that have come through, and we'll bring up a couple here for discussion. I just want to point out as well that if you did enter a question and we happen to not have time to address it, we'll do our best to get back to you directly after the webinar as well. So we will take note of it and make sure to make sure you get an answer. So the first couple, sort of going back to, I think, the general SBTi net zero discussion. So if Andres is out there, this may be questions for you, and I'll kind of give you two here. I think they're sort of related. One is whether SBTi and our net zero standard has a definition of permanent carbon renewals. And also if we distinguish, if and how we distinguish between what's considered abatable emissions and what are considered residual emissions at the actual sector company level.
Sure. So on the first question about permanent carbon removals, we did a little bit of work on this that you can read about in our Net Zero Foundations paper. And what's really important is that the duration of storage for removals is equivalent to how long the CO2 emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions are going to stay in the atmosphere, which could be more than 100 or several hundred years. The truth is that currently the accounting landscape for removals is still developing, still taking shape. So we don't have specific criteria for permanent removals. It is a topic that we expect to come back to at some point in the future, but also under the SBTi's net zero standard, most net zero targets are going to be further out into the future than 2030. So our recommendation is for companies to really stay focused on beyond value chain mitigation in a more broad sense, not to get too stuck up on what is a permanent removal just yet. On the second question on what is considered abatable, that is really the focus of the pathways work and section of this presentation that you were watching today. We require companies to set near-term and long-term SBTs that are purely focused on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions before bringing in removals and offsets. We are drawing from as much research and consultation as possible. So the IEA's net zero scenario, of course, is one possible option that's being explored for cement, and looking all the way out actually to 2050. And how, what sort of intensity needs to be reached across the board at that point, asking companies to set targets to get there, because that's really what's needed for us to target our way to net zero at the global level.
Great, thank you very much. So moving more into more topic specific cement sector questions. There was some interest in the chat here in the Q&A about the option to use these pathways for cement customers. And related to that is traditionally SBTi's SDA pathways, the intensity pathways, applying only to scope 1 and 2 emissions. and how that might be available to a downstream company, potentially a cement customer, to use an intensity pathway to cover also their upstream scope 3 emissions. So I know that was discussed briefly that the guidance does go into that. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, Carl, as well.
Yeah, so the guidance explains how this should be done. Basically, when companies are setting their scope 3 targets, if they have to set a scope 3 target, they have a number of generic methods that we have. So there's physical intensity, economic intensity, absolute contraction, which have generic percentage reductions, annual linear reductions that they should be achieving in their scope 3 emissions. And that's what they would generally do for the bulk of their scope 3 emissions. However, what the advantage of this sectoral pathway for cement is that it's a different reduction rate, and that if a company, be it a concrete company or a construction company, for example, purchasing cement, they can instead use that sector-specific, cement-specific pathway to define their scope 3 emission, the scope 3 target reductions. So that may be at a different rate than the overall or the more generic sector agnostic rates. So the guidance provides information on how they can do that.
Great, thanks. And trying to kind of group topics here, there were a couple questions around, I think, accounting methods and expectations in the guidance. The first is, the question was, how are cementitious materials considered? So clinker cement substitutes, are they included when calculating emissions intensity?
Yeah, so one of the things we've defined in the guidance is, in fact, the denominator of our pathway, which is tons of CO2 per ton of cement or per ton of cementitious. And there we've taken the industry definition for cementitious product, which comes from the Cement CO2 Protocol. So basically, cementitious is clinker production plus clinker substitutes that are used to make cement, plus cement substitutes that are processed and sold by cement companies. So that means it gives an additional lever for companies to reduce their emissions per ton of cementitious. They can increase the sales of these kind of products. And it means that it doesn't make a huge difference at the global level, but it may make a difference for the individual companies. And then if we're talking about companies that are, for example, primarily focused on making cement substitutes, or are not making their own clinker, so they might be buying some clinker, some cement, and some cement substitutes such as granulated blast furnace slag. The guidance also gives rules for how this should be dealt with. So again, they can be using the cement pathway for the purchase of their cement and clinker, and they can be using the generic pathways for the purchase of other kinds of cement substitutes. And for their own emissions within their own production, which may come from grinding and drying and things like that, they'll be using fuels, they'll have electricity. They're using the cross-sector methods to define the emission level for the reductions for those. So it should all be covered.
Okay, thanks. And kind of keeping in the same area, you did mention the essentially around biogenic emissions accounting, following the kind of broader SBTi criteria on that. And I just wondered if you could go into a little bit more detail about whether there's any sort of specific sector-specific guidance around biogenic emissions, or is it generally recommended that the SBTi criteria is how emissions from organic sources are considered?
In general, we're relying on cross-sector criteria, but we do go into a little bit more detail of what this may look like for cement. So for cement companies, it's often the case that when they're using waste-derived fuels, that may include a biomass part, and cement companies that are developing targets will usually account for that biomass part as being carbon neutral. We can accept this, but it should be thoroughly justified. So we have some recommendations in the guidance on how to justify that the biomass part is carbon neutral, and if you can't justify that it's carbon neutral, you must include it within your target boundary. And we also have a requirement that has always been the case, and still the case, that even when you have biomass as a fuel and you may be claiming it's carbon neutral, you still need to account for those emissions and report them separately. So it is covered in that way. And we also note in the guidance, if the science changes whereby the standards, third-party standards, are increasingly asking for more sustainability criteria before you could justify a biomass fuel as being carbon neutral, then we would have to update the guidance to take this into account.
Great, thanks for that clarification. I think the next one here might be a little bit kind of broader, a little bit more philosophical, but I was wondering if you could talk to what we see as some of the key milestones that we think are needed to kind of follow these intensity pathways. So in some of the scenario modeling, what is actually out there? What are the coming years? What are our expectations, or what do we see as being necessary for these pathways to actually be met in the future?
Yeah, so what we see both in the IEA's scenarios, but also in industry roadmaps, is a reliance on what we would call the traditional levers to reduce emissions intensity in the next decade, and then more breakthrough technology. So the traditional levers being things like energy efficiency, clinker substitution, alternative fuels, and so on. And then the breakthrough technologies after 2030 are things like carbon capture and storage is the main one, but you can also think about hydrogen fuels and electrification. Now, we saw this as being a potential issue within the framework of science-based target setting for the sector, because a company could set a target that is having credible and ambitious reductions by 2030, but without having a plan for those breakthrough technologies to come online at scale for the subsequent decades. And this kind of weakens the credibility of whether or not their target is really going to lead to a 1.5 degree scenario and net zero by 2050. So in the guidance, we have some recommendations for companies when they're submitting their targets to provide evidence that they're thinking about this, whether it's through R&D investment this decade to make sure that those breakthrough technologies become available, or specific commitments that they are already publishing to have, for example, industrial scale carbon capture and storage plants by their near-term target year. Because we did hear comments from members of our expert advisory group that without these kind of assurances, the credibility of a near-term target might be at risk.
Great, thank you. One other question is the idea of sub-regional pathways and whether that was considered, because that is something that comes up pretty frequently in terms of what the shape and what the decarbonization rates of the industry might be on a sub-global level. So I was wondering if that was considered at all as well.
I'll answer this one for cement, and maybe Andres can give a more generic answer. For cement, we didn't feel this was necessary. In fact, for the large industrial sectors, because we use this convergence approach, we don't see the need for regionalized pathways, because technology around the world is supposed to converge to a similar emissions intensity by a future year, for example, 2050. And because the convergence approach takes into account the starting point, as in the base year emissions for each company, it also takes into account maybe different levels of development in different countries. And it means near-term targets are not necessarily always at the same level, because they depend on the base year. So thanks to this approach, we haven't felt the need for regionalized pathways in the industrial sectors in general, but in the cement sector specifically, we have not really received any kind of requests for regionalized pathways.
I can jump in and just say that on the SBTi, we don't have regional pathways for any of our sectors currently available, but there are a few sectors where we're looking into it. And some of the questions that we are asking within the scope of other sector-specific projects are the extent to which companies' emissions sources might be regionally located versus globally mixed, the extent to which demand that a company is serving might be regionally focused versus global in scope, and also just conducting more empirical analyses to understand what the differences actually look like when it comes to a percentage-based target across different regions. So that's the sort of cross-sector answer.
And keeping on that topic, and this is probably one for really anybody on the panel, but there's a question about other heavy industries that don't have an SDA right now, or sectors that we are looking at, and kind of what the status is of those other industries in terms of either updates to existing SDA or guidance that we have published, or sectors that we might be looking at as well.
Happy to answer that one as well. I mean, we do have quite a few sector-specific projects that are in the works right now, and you can find information about those on our website. We are working on the building sector. We are working on maritime transport. There's a 1.5 degree pathway for the aviation sector that's currently under development that will be incorporated into the new sector-specific guidance for aviation soon. And for sectors that aren't covered by any sort of sector-specific project or guidance document, companies are really recommended to be using our cross-sector pathway and cross-sector methods. And even companies in a sector that does have sector-specific pathways and guidance available should consider using the cross-sector pathway. For many companies, it is perfectly adequate to set an absolute target rather than a sector-specific intensity target. And just to mention, I didn't name all of the sectors that we have work on. I think also forestry, land use, and agriculture I had mentioned previously, chemicals, and I might miss a few, so please do just check out our website if you're interested in a full overview.
Great, thank you, Andres. So I did want to pose one question before we wrap up here. I think this is an important one to Antonio, and that is, what's your message to companies that have not yet taken action to limit their emissions to the 1.5C pathways? And if you can expand a little bit more, I know you talked a little bit about the benefits that you've already seen through setting an SBT. But if from the company perspective, what you might provide to some of your peers in the industry.
Yeah, I think, well, as you mentioned, Mike, I think I've used all the reasons I find interesting, but let me recap on that. I think first for us was really, I can acknowledge that it's a challenge to do so in organizations. It requires a lot of convincing internally and understanding and also a little bit of looking forward, things maybe that are not in place, but it's all worth it. I think I will invite those practitioners, whoever is responsible to drive those strategies to pursue. For us has been a no-brainer, and the benefits are there. Just to recap really again, incredibly boosting the organization in terms of motivation, acceleration of impacts and actions, and sense of purpose. I think you guys have managed really to have this brand behind you, and it's fantastic to work towards a target that has been already validated. And also externally, we can see that a number of stakeholders are more and more interested. So it's becoming sort of a must-have, and I guess my message would be the sooner the better. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. So I think we've covered what we can here. Anybody, like I mentioned, if you happen to type in a question that we didn't get to today, we will certainly reach out and answer your question. But I think I'll probably pass it back to Carl to kind of close things out for us.
Great, thank you very much, Mike, and thanks to everybody for your questions. Very interesting. So we're just going to put the slides back on the screen to show one or two last things. One is how you can provide your feedback. So as we've said before, the open consultation is launching today and will run until the 15th of April. So please go to the website, the link there, and find that consultation. It'll be going live shortly after this webinar later today. A recording of this webinar will be made available as well on our webpage if you'd like to circulate that to colleagues who didn't have the chance to participate today. And then the final thing I would say is about the feedback that we will receive through the consultation. We will consider it all, of course, and we will discuss it with our expert advisory group. But we don't guarantee that all perspectives will be able to be taken into account in the final deliverables. So as a reminder, the final deliverables will be published in June, and we hope that that will provide the resources needed for companies, even more companies, to start setting targets in this sector. We go to the last slide, we just have our contact details there. If you ever need to contact myself or Amir with questions about this project, please do. And with that, I'll wrap up this webinar. Thank you all very much for your participation today. Thank you very much for our panelists as well. And I wish you a very good rest of the day.